The most successful scientists can tell a great story.
Science is messy and complicated and hard and human.
Trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions.
There are all sorts of psychological effects of narrative.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories.
I think storytelling is hugely underrated but massively important part of science.
How are we going to tell a story with this data?
Hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told.
Hello and welcome back to the Storyology Podcast, where I, material scientist and storyteller Dr. Anna Pajajski, take a deep dive into the intersection between science and storytelling. We're tracking the presence of story down the pipeline of how science gets done, from funding to publishing to public dissemination in the media. Right now, we're examining the start of the process, the role of story in deciding what science gets the funding for it to happen in the first place. Last time, we heard that when it comes to getting science funded, the most successful researchers are able to write about themselves persuasively as a character, as well as characterise the potential beneficiaries of the research and even the interview panels themselves. Story structure can also help scientists to stand out, starting with a hook and then telling a consistent narrative that repeats the important information again and again to capture and keep the grant panel's attention. And we saw how persuasive writing in grants focuses on the storytelling concept of change, how the world and characters will be transformed if only the funder will part with the cash necessary for the scientists to go ahead with their ideas. Now, not to be all doom and gloom, but this episode we're going to be hearing from our researchers and funders about the problems with the way that academic science is funded in the UK and the risks we run when we use storytelling as part of that system. This time we hear from
Dr. Alex Baker,
Ravi Desai,
Dr. Jess,
Louise Kenny.
and
Andrew Clark.
who you met last time, and also
Yeah, so hi, I'm Clara Barker. I'm a material researcher. I make thin films. I have a Daphne Jackson Trust fellowship, which is sponsored by the Royal Society of Chemistry. But I also take on all sorts of various EDI hats, and I am the Inclusion and Diversity Representative for the Institute of Physics Council.
I asked all of them about the problems with the system as it currently stands. The first thing that emerged from Alex was that the current way of doing things doesn't reward long-term thinking.
I think in the UK, we're perhaps still a bit trapped in that mindset. I mean, one of my favorite quotes from a colleague is, to do kind of building cathedrals, where he says, sometimes we get so focused on the bricks, we forget to build anything with it. And actually, we should be building, cathedrals of science. And that is things like the COVID vaccine and, new medicines, new diagnostics, new battery technology. That's the cathedral of science that people actually see. Whilst sometimes we get so focused on the kinetics of a reaction, which is great. But when everyone just looks at kinetics, we're not actually building anything with it. And I do worry sometimes that we get very focused on that. And certainly at elite universities, I think there is a habit to sometimes lose sight and go, well, if I do this very not scientifically applied research, but with all these instruments, and I prove 100% this is the reaction mechanism, and I can get a really good publication, it's kind of like, that's great. But in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, what's the impact of that publication beyond just a citation number? And I think that there is this tension, I think, that pulls people in the short-term metric direction of, well, we need to get stuff published rather than committing, 10 years, 20 years. Let's talk about how we actually get this to market, how we can make it a spin out, how we can actually help people, which, I think is pressures from government, pressures from other metrics as well. Yeah.
This lack of long-term thinking makes sense if you consider that most grants will have a timescale in the order of months or years rather than decades. Grant panels also want to see some concrete impact, which would disincentivize science from writing grants as an open-ended story. Alex went on to describe how the current funding model also doesn't favour working together.
From my experience, I'm always amazed how the current funding model doesn't necessarily favor collaboration unless you're going for very big numbers. But I was kind of sitting there the other day thinking about, well, hang on, if we're putting all this money into science and the way we're approaching certain diseases. And actually, if some funding was really put into bringing all these scientists together early on to have real in-depth discussions, we could spend that money far more effectively. So I'm always amazed at how much kind of duplication there is in instrumentation and things like that, where universities, want to compete for a league table position, because that's how we guarantee undergraduate funding. And that drags us down competing with each other. Like, there have been some big grants recently where they haven't been funded. And I won't go into too much detail about them, but there's almost a lack of collaboration where lots of universities were good at a certain topic, felt they could do it by themselves, and the researchers were pushed in that direction because they could get more money per person by doing it by themselves. However, that meant that actually all those 10 applications were far weaker than if they all came together and wrote one amazing application. And that probably would have had a greater chance of success, much bigger impact nationally. But those kind of the slightly almost selfish, we need money as a university, researchers need money for CVs, I think got in the way of us doing good science there. And I think that's really disappointing when we think about this is taxpayer money at the end of the day, and we're just not using it as effectively as we would want. And there probably are better systems. Yeah.
From a story perspective, I've been thinking for a while about how science is quite an ego-driven industry. I don't mean this in the sense that scientists have big egos, although I've certainly met some individuals like that, but that stories of big achievements and discoveries and awards are attached to the name of an individual protagonist, an individual scientist, rather than a network of collaborators. I put this idea to Jess that it is actually quite difficult to tell a compelling story with the team as a protagonist, and this is what she said.
Yeah, although it is hard, but it's not impossible. I found it recently for these big team science grants that we've been applying for. One that I wrote last year was 55 people in the team. And then to do the kind of applicant and team capability to deliver, which is your narrative CV, takes like a week. That's really when at the end of that, when you find out you don't get it, you're like, what have I spent my life doing? But you really have to kind of weave people's different stories together. And I think the same thing. I'm not imagining you continue to apply for funding where you've got 55 people in the team, because that's obviously, it's impossible to get them all in the room at the same time, let alone on paper. But I think if you've got a team of 4 people who are bringing in different expertise, different backgrounds, it's quite easy to weave how they'd all work together or the impact that they'd have. I think it means that you can have different, I don't know, I'm saying this for the first time without really thinking about it, but it means you can have different people for people to kind of look up to or resonate with them for different aspects of it. You saw it a lot during the pandemic, right? You had the people making the vaccines, you had the public health doctors who were communicating the message, you had epidemiologists who were looking at population studies or whatever. And you could see different aspects of yourself or things that you valued in each of those different people within that team. And then you could trust the process. So I think actually that diversity within teams, both of background and every other protected characteristic, helps people see the real side of science. Even though it's harder to tell in some media, but I wouldn't say it's harder to tell in all different media. And I think the really key thing that I didn't say in just background and protected characteristics is also career stage and kind of career family that you're in. Making it clear that the PhD students who conduct most of the critical research are really key members of that team. The grant will be awarded to the professor. The award will probably be awarded to the professor, but the person doing the research is the PhD student or the postdoc who's on a short-term contract and massively underpaid or undervalued, and making sure it's really clear that they're front and center members of that team. And actually something I care really passionately about is also recognizing the contributions of technical staff. So kind of research technical professionals, without whom none of the science that we do today would be possible. And also the kind of HR staff, the professional services staff who help you develop all these proposals, who are there for you when you need to book that, access to that microscope, and who have such intricate understanding of these complicated funding processes. And there's just such an unequal distribution of power within academia that these people, students, HR people, technical professionals are so critical to get anything done, but so undervalued and usually on fixed term contracts. So you're not actually allowed to name them on a grant, because if your grant extends for beyond their contract, they can't be named on it. So you can have the HR person who's done everything, or the technical professional who does absolutely everything for the group, and they can get no kind of professional recognition. And that just seems absolutely mad.
Clearly, then, there's a huge, let's optimistically call it, opportunity for the system of science funding to improve to allow us to name all of the necessary cogs in the wheel. I put this idea of the celebrity scientist to Alex.
Sarah Gilbert. Yeah. Because she is, I think, an amazing example of the opposite of that, where, yes, she's been held up as this amazing scientist, and she is undoubtedly an amazing scientist, where she was kind of put in the royal box at Wimbledon and things like that. And I think she almost felt overawed by that, because she's kind of, well, hang on, my whole team behind me. Actually, my housemate was working in Oxford at the time, and he had to ring up to get kind of a specialist to come and see a patient. And he actually rung up Sarah Gilbert. And even though, despite all the COVID-19 success, she was still on the end of the phone doing her day job as a consultant in the NHS, and still with just as much respect as any other colleague. And I think that is a sign of an amazing scientist that realizes the strength of teams, and that you can't do it by yourself. Is that she still got on with her day job straight after that. Because I think sometimes we do forget, and there's this desire with kind of all these prizes to go, oh, well, this PI did everything. It's like, well, hang on, that PI has a team of 30 behind them. The way we do Nobel Prizes, it's so frustrating, because it focuses on one person when they may have had the idea, but the realization of that science has been students and postdocs.
Thinking again about how story comes into this, I wonder if trying to simplify the story in a grant is also going some way to erasing collaborators and junior members of staff, because we are more accustomed to following heroes and leaders as protagonists rather than a team of 20 or 30 people. And this relates to a second theme that emerged from my conversations, which is that the current grant system has incredibly high competition rates, combined with tight timescales and very, very low success rates, making it incredibly inefficient as a system. Here's grant writer Ravi on how that might also disincentivize including too many collaborators on a grant.
I'm not sure this is a systemic problem, but it might just be inherent to the process, and that it's reconciling the timescales involved. The timescales with getting these scientists to provide scientific input, of getting the finance team to provide details about the budget that's needed, for getting collaborators to provide information about everything from their CV to the scientific input that they can give, to coordinating with their finance teams. And then there's the challenge of the timescale. The funder has a hard deadline, and so you have to play by their rules. And then there's usually a 6-month lag, at least, between funding submission of the application and knowing what the outcome of the application is. And in the meantime, you don't just sit there and twiddle your thumbs. You're progressing the science. So when the outcome lands in your hands, if it's successful, then ideally you've sculpted the original applications that it can be tackled 6+ months later when it is actually funded.
And because of this, I later put to Ravi that scientists must therefore be juggling multiple applications at the same time, knowing that they won't all be successful.
That's right. That's right. And that's a challenge that I think any grant writer takes for, pun intended, granted, that probably 80% of their applications are going to be non-successful, just because that's how the system works. So to put it harshly, we fail at 80% of what we do, but we try again. So maybe we're foolish for doing so, but we make it work.
I think this is worth repeating. 80% of these grant stories are going to fail in their aim of persuading funders to cough up the cash. Having sat on some grant panels herself, researcher Clara told it from the other side.
One thing that I really found is that, if you're looking at a whole bunch of fellowships, for example, 90% of them are excellent. If you had the money, you could sponsor 90% of them. Sometimes there's a clear brilliant one, sometimes there's a clear bad one, but the truth is that most of them are such high quality. Most people who are at the stage where they're writing fellowship applications are already at a very good stage with a very good track record. And so I think that's what shocked me the most, is just how competitive, how fine margins it is, just because there are so many amazing scientists out there. And in many ways, it's a real shame that, you can't just fund everyone. It's like, we'd love to be able to just fund all the good projects that have merit. We'd love, it'd be great if we could fund them, because I think we'd have so much amazing science coming out. But yeah, it's really, really fine margins. And on the whole, it is. And so I think that's a big reason why we need to have those additional information and that extra work. And I've heard it talked about, in science citizenship, the amount of added value to the science world, not just science. I think that is the main thing, just how close it is and how tight it is. And I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, because it's now I'm like, oh my goodness.
And Louise, another scientist who has sat on a lot of grant panels, agreed.
You can have brilliant science and a great idea, but if you write a really poor grant, you're going to struggle, especially just now, right, where science is just like humming. And we're at the bleeding edge of so many disciplines, and it's such a competitive funding environment. I take it as given that if you get as far as a shortlist in an MLC competition, your science is going to be world class. To just get to the shortlist, it's going to be world class. And so then you're trying to choose from brilliant science here and brilliant science here and brilliant science here. And the impact is, again, normally a given. And so what we're really looking for is, those 2 degrees of difference, and where we think it's something aligns with strategic priorities, and definitely scientists' ability, clinician scientists and scientists' ability to sell that concept and tell that story is really important. Something we don't get taught at medical school or when we're doing our postdocs or whatever, but it's very, very important. And the most successful scientists, not always, but in general, the most successful scientists can tell a great story. They can explain their science to the public. They can explain their science to the funders. They can really, they're just great communicators.
So in such a competitive environment, if all of the scientists are top quality and their ideas are all top quality, the difference is in the story that they tell. We've already heard, though, how crafting a compelling story might lead scientists to favour depicting a heroic individual protagonist over a collaborative team, overlooking the characters with less power in the system. I asked Andrew, someone coming at it from a funder's perspective, what problematic narratives he sees in the funding world.
It's something like a hope, something like a promise, something like an expectation. But as I say, in practice, everybody knows it won't run on those exact lines. And so there's kind of this part of the story you're telling is how you'll respond to setbacks, unexpected changes. So if you just see a proposal that only considers what happens if everything succeeds, that's actually a little bit of an amber flag, because you want them to kind of show, it's often done in terms of risk mitigation or something quite formal like that has its own particular narrative structure. But in general, it's at least some sense of, you want them, a sense of someone being really creative in how they'll solve the problems and the obstacles that come along the way.
It strikes me that, as in all fictional stories, here there's an element of a suspension of disbelief. Everybody knows it isn't exactly going to go like this, but we still all pretend at this stage that it is. But ultimately, as Andrew mentioned, some funding applications do encourage scientists to anticipate challenges and obstacles along the way. Now, if they've presented their application as a story with a compelling protagonist, etc., and then we see that protagonist is going to encounter some obstacles, our narrative expectation is that those obstacles can or will be overcome, because that's what happens in an archetypal story. But these stories in grant applications are in the future tense. There is actually no hard evidence at all that those obstacles will or can be overcome. So, narrative storytelling is a hugely persuasive device that potentially gives readers a false sense of possibility. Those narrative expectations lead us to predict success, and this suppresses other narratives around failure. Louise attributes that back to this competitive culture.
I do think we work in a culture where, it's a competitive culture. Science, we're getting better at team science, and we are. I think I'm a glass half full person, so I do think we're getting better at team science. But science is still very competitive. We're often in international or even inter-country races with other groups. It's quite a competitive environment, and so in any competition, you want to show your best, you want to talk about your successes. No one really wants to talk about their failures. I think where we've got a problem is around the narrative. Just because it didn't work doesn't mean it's a failure. It can be judged on what we did learn from it. It can be judged on the new hypotheses it sparked. It can be judged on how it's closed down what would have been ultimately either a harmful or unhelpful line of treatment or but we're not great. We're still not great at that narrative, and I think there needs to be a bit of a cultural change. But by definition, scientists are pretty competitive. You kind of have to be because we're chasing small resources in a competitive environment, and competition doesn't tolerate a lack of success.
And this brings us back to where we started. It seems that most of the issues around scientific funding stem from the fact that it is hugely competitive. In order to stand out from the crowd, the most successful scientists are communicating their ideas as a compelling story, with attractive characters, concrete resolutions, and narratives of successfully overcoming any future challenges. But this is not necessarily a fair approach. By making an attractive character out of the lead individuals, members of the team who hold less power in the system become relegated to furniture or removed from the cast list completely. Secondly, scientists play the game by applying with short-term ideas that are more likely to lead to outcomes favourable to universities, funders, and their own careers, rather than pursue longer-term collaborative endeavours. And ultimately, all any of us are doing in this game is speculatively laying down our hopes and dreams that would be possible if only someone would wave a magic wand and give us the resources to do so. If that's not a fairy tale, I don't know what is. Next time, we'll hear from our experts about some potential solutions to these problems and think about the other side of story's double-edged sword. This podcast is made in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network, Sonic Screen Lab at University of the Arts London, and StoryArcs at Bath Spa University. StoryArcs is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded programme. All of the opinions shared in this podcast are those of the individuals named and don't necessarily represent those of their employers. I've been your host, Anna Pajajski, and if you want to read more about my work around science and story, head over to the Storyology website at storyology.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.